The candles had barely been lit when the front door of the Whitlock house was struck 3 times, hard and fast, and Adrian knew before she even rose from her chair that the knock did not belong to a friend. Her mother, Margaret, went pale and set down her needlework. Her father, Edward, straightened his collar with shaking hands. Everyone in the room understood who stood outside, because the whole village had spoken of nothing else for 2 days. The Duke of Ashforde was coming to dinner, and he was not coming out of kindness. Adrian stood first. While her parents hesitated, she walked to the door herself, chin lifted, refusing to let her hands tremble the way her mother's had. When she pulled it open, she found herself face to face with a tall man in a dark green coat, his expression already set in quiet disapproval, as though the house itself had offended him simply by existing. "You must be the daughter," he said, before she could even offer a greeting. His voice was smooth, controlled, and utterly without warmth. "I was told the Whitlocks kept a modest home. I did not expect modest to mean this small." Adrian felt heat rise in her chest, but she did not let it reach her face. "And I was told a duke would have better manners than to insult a house before he has even stepped inside it," she replied. "It appears we were both given false information." For a moment, Julian Ashforde said nothing. His pale eyes studied her, the way a merchant studies a coin he suspects might be false, turning it over, searching for the flaw. Then, without another word, he stepped past her into the hall, leaving her standing in the cold evening air, with her heart pounding harder than she wanted to admit. Dinner had been planned for 3 days, every dish chosen with care, every chair polished until it gleamed. None of it seemed to matter to the Duke. He sat at the head of the table as though it were his own, glancing at the modest silverware with an expression that suggested he had eaten from finer plates in stables. Edward attempted polite conversation about the harvest. Julian answered in short, clipped sentences that made it clear he considered the topic beneath him. Margaret asked about his journey. He said it had been long and unnecessary, and that he hoped it would not need repeating. Adrian watched her parents shrink under his indifference, and something inside her hardened. She had heard the rumors about the true reason for his visit, a dispute over the boundary of Whitlock land, a stretch of fields that had belonged to her family for 3 generations, now suddenly claimed by the Ashforde estate through some old paper no one in the village had ever seen. She had told herself she would stay quiet tonight, that she would let her father handle matters of business, that a woman speaking out of turn at a duke's table could bring nothing but trouble. She lasted exactly until the 2nd course. "I understand," Julian said, cutting into his meat without looking up, "that there is some confusion regarding the eastern fields. I am told your family believes them to be yours." "We do not believe it," Adrian said before her father could answer. "We know it. My grandfather cleared that land with his own hands. There are records in the church that prove it." Julian's eyes lifted to hers, sharp with surprise, as though the chairs themselves had begun speaking. "Records can be wrong," he said, "or lost, or conveniently remembered." "As can the memories of dukes who have never once walked those fields," Adrian replied, "yet arrive at dinner already certain they belong to someone else." A silence dropped over the table so complete that Adrian could hear the candle flames hiss. Her mother's fork froze halfway to her mouth. Her father's face had gone the color of old parchment. Even the servant standing near the door seemed to stop breathing. Adrienne kept her gaze steady on the Duke, refusing to look away first, though her pulse hammered against her throat. Julian set down his knife slowly. "You dare to speak to me this way in my own investigation?" "I dare to speak the truth in my own home," Adrian said. "If that offends you, then perhaps the truth is not what you came here expecting." For a long moment, nobody moved. Then, to the shock of everyone at the table, including Adrian herself, the corner of Julian's mouth shifted. It was not quite a smile. It was something closer to surprise mixed with reluctant respect, the expression of a man who had walked into a room certain of how the evening would unfold, only to have every expectation overturned in a single sentence. "Interesting," he said quietly, almost to himself. "Very interesting." The rest of the meal continued in a strange, charged quiet. Edward tried twice more to steer the conversation toward safer waters, and twice more Julian ignored him entirely, his attention drifting back again and again to the woman seated across the table who had spoken to him as no one had dared to speak in years. Adrian could feel his gaze on her like a weight, and she hated how aware of it she became, how her skin seemed to prickle each time his eyes lingered a moment too long. When the final course was cleared away, Julian rose from his chair and thanked Margaret for the meal in a tone that, for the first time all evening, held something resembling genuine courtesy. He turned to Edward and said he would return in the morning to examine the boundary papers himself, rather than relying on the account given to him by his estate manager. It was a small concession, but Edward's shoulders sagged with relief all the same. As the Duke made his way to the door, he paused beside Adrian, who had risen to see him out only because her mother's sharp glance had commanded it. "You are either the bravest woman I have met," Julian said quietly, so only she could hear, "or the most foolish." "Perhaps I am simply the only one in this village willing to tell you the truth," Adrian answered. "The rest are too frightened of your title to remember you are still just a man." Something flickered behind his eyes, there and gone so quickly she almost doubted she had seen it. He said nothing more. He simply inclined his head, the smallest gesture of acknowledgement, and stepped out into the night. Adrian closed the door behind him and leaned against it, letting out a breath she had not realized she was holding. Her mother appeared at once, wringing her hands. "Have you lost your senses?" Margaret whispered fiercely. "Do you understand what a man like that could do to us? He could take everything, Adrian. The house, the land, all of it, and there would be nothing we could do to stop him." "He could have done that regardless of what I said tonight," Adrian replied. "At least now he knows we will not simply hand it over without a fight." Her father, standing quietly by the hearth, looked at her with an expression she could not quite read. There was worry in it, yes, but also something like pride, buried beneath the fear. "You remind me of your grandmother," he said softly. "She never backed down from anyone either. It got her into no small amount of trouble. Did it work out for her in the end?" Adrian asked. Edward managed a tired smile, more often than it should have. That night, Adrian lay awake long after the house had gone silent, staring at the ceiling while the events of the evening replayed themselves over and over in her mind. She told herself she was only anxious about the fields, about the future of her family's home, about the very real danger a man with Julian Ashford's power represented. She told herself the strange, unsettled feeling in her chest was nothing more than the aftershock of confrontation, the way a person's hands still shake after narrowly avoiding a fall. She almost believed it too, until she remembered the look on his face when she had challenged him, the flicker of something behind his cold eyes that had not been anger at all. It had looked, unmistakably, like curiosity. And curiosity, Adrian knew, from a man who held the power to destroy everything her family had built, was perhaps the most dangerous thing of all. Outside, beneath a sky heavy with clouds, Julian rode back toward his estate in silence, his mind circling a single unanswered question he could not seem to set aside. In all his years, no one beneath his rank had ever spoken to him the way Adrian Whitlock had at that table. No one had ever dared. He told himself it meant nothing, that she was simply a stubborn country girl unaware of the danger she courted, that he would resolve the matter of the boundary swiftly and never think of her again. But even as he told himself this, some quiet, insistent part of his mind was already looking forward to morning, and to the prospect of seeing her again. Morning came gray and damp, mist clinging low over the eastern fields as Julian rode out with two of his men to examine the boundary himself. Adrian had expected him to send a clerk, some junior official with a satchel of papers and no patience for questions. She had not expected the Duke to dismount at the edge of the disputed land, kneel down, and run his fingers through the soil as though the earth itself might tell him something the documents could not. "You did not need to come yourself," she said, walking out to meet him with her shawl pulled tight against the cold. "I find," Julian replied without looking up, "that documents are easily forged, but land remembers who has tended it. These furrows were not cut recently. Someone has worked this soil for a very long time. My grandfather," Adrian said. "Then my father. Then when my father's back began to trouble him, myself, more often than either of them would like to admit." Julian finally looked up at her, and there was something almost startled in his expression, as though the idea of a woman working a field with her own hands had never occurred to him as a real possibility, only as a phrase used carelessly by people who had never seen it done. "You labor in the fields yourself? Someone must, and I do not see why it should shame me to admit it," Adrian said. "Not everyone has the luxury of sitting behind a desk deciding who owns what, while others do the actual work of the land." She expected anger. She had grown used to expecting it from him after the previous night. Instead, Julian rose slowly, brushing the soil from his hands, and studied her with an expression that was difficult to name. "You say that as though you believe I have never worked for anything in my life." "Have you?" "I have worked," he said, "for things you cannot see, approval, duty, the weight of a name that was never truly my choosing." He paused, as though surprised he had said so much. "But no, I have never worked a field. I will not pretend otherwise." It was the first honest thing he had said to her, and it disarmed Adrian more than any argument could have. She found herself studying him differently, searching past the cold exterior for whatever lay beneath it. The examination of the boundary took the better part of the day. Julian questioned the tenant farmers who worked the neighboring plots, cross-referenced their accounts against the church records Edward produced, and even sent one of his men back to the estate to retrieve older maps from the Ashforde archives. By evening, he had found nothing to support the claim his estate manager had made, and everything to support the Whitlock's account. He did not announce this outright. Instead, over a second dinner that Margaret insisted on preparing despite her husband's protest that they could not afford to feed a duke twice in 1 week, Julian informed the family that he required several more days to complete a thorough investigation, and that he would be staying at the local inn rather than returning to his estate each night. Adrian suspected, even then, that the investigation had little left to uncover. The days that followed fell into an unexpected rhythm. Julian appeared each morning, sometimes with legitimate questions about the land, more often with questions that had nothing to do with boundaries at all. He asked Adrian about the books she read, and seemed genuinely astonished to learn she had taught herself Latin from an old volume left behind by a traveling tutor years earlier. He asked about her friendship with Clara Bennett, the miller's daughter, and listened with unexpected attentiveness as Adrian described how the two of them had once tried to build a raft across the river and nearly drowned for their trouble. In turn, Adrian found herself asking questions she had never expected to ask a duke. What was it like, growing up with a title already decided before he had taken his first breath? Had he ever wanted anything for himself that was not first weighed against what his family expected? Did he ever grow tired of people bowing before they had even looked him in the eye? To her surprise, he answered, haltingly. At first, as though the words had grown rusty from disuse, and then more freely, until an afternoon walk along the river became an hour, and the hour became an entire evening spent talking beneath a sky slowly filling with stars. My mother arranged 3 separate courtships for me before I turned 20, Julian admitted one evening, as they sat on a low stone wall overlooking the fields that had so recently divided them. Each woman was chosen for her family's standing, her wealth, her usefulness to the Ashforde name. Not one of them was chosen because anyone believed I might actually wish to spend my life beside her. And did you, Adrian asked, wish to spend your life beside any of them? I did not know them well enough to wish for anything, Julian said. That was rather the point. Wishing was never meant to enter into it. Adrian studied his profile in the fading light, the sharp line of his jaw, the tension that seemed to live permanently in his shoulders, as though he had spent so many years bracing against expectation that he no longer remembered how to stand without it. That sounds like a very lonely way to live, she said quietly. It is the only way I have known, Julian replied. Then, after a pause, until recently. He did not elaborate, and Adrian did not press him, though her heart had begun to beat strangely fast, and she was grateful for the darkness that hid the color rising in her cheeks. Word of the Duke's extended stay spread through the village faster than any fire. By the end of the first week, the baker's wife was telling customers that the Duke of Ashforde had been seen walking with Adrian Whitlock along the river 3 evenings in a row. By the second week, Beatrice Fairweather, who fancied herself the keeper of all local gossip, had constructed an entire narrative in which Adrian had somehow bewitched the Duke through means she refused to specify, but implied were not entirely respectable. Adrian heard the whispers wherever she went. In the market, women who had known her since childhood suddenly regarded her with narrowed eyes, some with envy, others with open suspicion, as though her sudden closeness with a duke made her somehow less trustworthy than she had been the week before. Clara, at least, remained steadfastly loyal, though even she could not resist teasing her friend mercilessly whenever the subject arose. "You are blushing again," Clara said one afternoon, as the two of them sat by the mill watching the water turn the great wheel. "You did not blush even when Nathaniel Cole's son tried to court you for 2 entire years." "I am not blushing," Adrian said, blushing. "He is a duke, Adrian. A duke. Do you understand what that means? Men like that do not stay in country inns and walk beside rivers because they enjoy the scenery." "He is investigating a land dispute," Adrian said, though the words felt thinner each time she repeated them, as though she herself no longer fully believed them. "The land dispute was settled within the first 3 days," Clara said, not unkindly. "Everyone in the village knows it." "He is staying for you." Adrian said nothing, because she suspected her friend was right, and the realization frightened her more than she wanted to admit. A duke's attention was not a small thing. It was not a passing curiosity that could be set aside once satisfied. If Julian's interest in her was genuine, it would bring consequences neither of them could easily undo, consequences that would fall far harder on her than on him. She resolved, that evening, to create some distance between them. It lasted exactly 1 day. Julian arrived the following afternoon not with questions about boundaries or Latin books, but with an unusually serious expression that immediately caught Adrian's attention. He asked if she would walk with him, and something in his tone told her this was not another idle conversation about childhood memories or family expectations. "My steward informs me," Julian said, once they were far enough from the house that no one could overhear, "that there are irregularities in the boundary papers beyond what I first suspected. Someone altered the original survey lines. Someone within my own estate." Adrian's stomach tightened. "Who?" "I do not yet know for certain," Julian admitted, "but I intend to find out, and when I do, I promise you, your family's land will remain exactly where it has always belonged." "Why does this matter so much to you?" Adrian asked. "A week ago, you would not have cared whether we lost every field we owned." Julian stopped walking and turned to face her fully, his expression unguarded in a way she had not yet seen from him. "A week ago," he said, "I had not yet met you." The words hung in the air between them, simple and devastating in their honesty. Adrian felt her carefully constructed distance crumbling, felt the wall she had promised herself she would maintain beginning to give way beneath the weight of his gaze. "You should not say things like that to me," she managed finally. "It is not fair, not to either of us." "I know," Julian said. "I have told myself the same thing every night for the past week, and every morning I find myself riding back here regardless." He reached out, hesitated, then let his hand fall back to his side without touching her, as though even he understood how much was at stake in that small distance between them. "I do not know what to do with what I am feeling, Adrian. I was not raised to feel it at all." Before Adrian could respond, the sound of hoofbeats interrupted them, and both turned to see one of Julian's men riding hard toward the estate, his face grim with urgent news. Julian excused himself at once, his expression shifting instantly back into the composed mask of a man accustomed to crisis, and rode off without another word, leaving Adrian standing alone in the field, with her heart in complete disarray, and an unanswered question hanging heavy in the evening air. She did not yet know that the news carried by that rider would change everything, unraveling not only the mystery of the altered boundary papers, but threatening the fragile, unnamed thing that had begun to grow between them. The urgent news, as it turned out, concerned a fire that had broken out in one of the Ashforde grain stores, though by the time Julian arrived it had been contained with only minor losses. Still, the incident kept him occupied at his estate for 3 full days, during which Adrian heard nothing from him at all. She told herself this was for the best, that the silence gave her time to gather her thoughts, to remember who she was and who he was, and how impossibly far apart those two things remained, no matter how close a riverside conversation might have made them feel. She was still telling herself this when Henry Wren, her father's old friend and the closest thing the village had to a lawyer, arrived at the Whitlock house with a folded letter and a face drawn tight with concern. "It concerns the eastern fields," Henry said. Once Margaret had settled everyone at the table with tea, neither of them touched. "I have been making inquiries of my own, given the family's interest in the matter, and I have learned something troubling." "Go on," Edward said. "The alteration to the boundary survey was not a clerical error," Henry said. "It was deliberate. And it was not ordered by the Duke, nor even by his primary steward. It came from a man named Edmund Voss, a member of the Ashforde Council who has, for some time now, been quietly buying up disputed land throughout the region at reduced prices, using his position to manufacture the very disputes that drive the price down in the first place." Adrian felt a cold, sharp anger settle in her chest. "He created a false claim on our land so that we would be forced to sell it to him cheaply, out of fear of losing it entirely." "That is my belief, yes," Henry said. "And you are not the only family this has happened to. I found records of at least 3 other disputes over the past 2 years, all involving land that eventually came into Voss's possession, under circumstances no one thought to question. Because who would dare question a man who served so closely under a duke?" "Does Julian know?" Adrian asked, before she could stop herself from using his given name in front of her parents, who exchanged a glance she pretended not to notice. "I cannot say what the Duke knows," Henry said carefully. "But if he does not know yet, he should be told at once. And if he does know and has said nothing, then perhaps the Whitlock family's trust in him has been badly misplaced." Adrian rode to the Ashforde estate herself the following morning, ignoring her mother's protests that a young unmarried woman had no business arriving unannounced at a duke's residence. She was shown into a grand hall she had never seen before, all cold marble and towering windows, so unlike the warm, cluttered comfort of her own home, that she felt suddenly, sharply aware of every difference between her world and his. Julian appeared moments later, and whatever relief crossed his face at the sight of her vanished the instant he registered her expression. "What has happened?" he asked. "Edmund Voss," Adrian said, "has been manufacturing false land disputes across this entire region, buying the disputed land at reduced prices. Once frightened families are forced to sell, rather than risk losing everything to a legal battle they cannot afford to fight. Our land was meant to be his next acquisition. Julian's face went very still. That is a serious accusation. It is not an accusation. It is the truth, and I would have hoped, after everything, that you would trust me enough to believe it without demanding proof first. I did not say I doubted you, Julian said, his voice tightening. I said it was serious. Serious accusations require careful handling, Adrian. If I move against a member of my own council without absolute certainty, I risk destabilizing the entire estate and giving Voss the opportunity to hide whatever evidence exists before I can act on it. So you will do nothing? I did not say that either. Julian's jaw tightened, frustration evident in the sharp line of his shoulders. You forget that I am not simply a man who can act on impulse. Every decision I make ripples through hundreds of lives that depend on this estate. I must be certain. How convenient, Adrian said, her voice rising despite her efforts to control it. That certainty always seems to require just enough delay to let men like Voss finish what they started. The words struck harder than she had intended, and she saw them land, saw something flash behind Julian's eyes that was not quite anger and not quite hurt, but some uncomfortable combination of both. You truly believe I would protect a man who has been stealing from families like yours, simply to avoid the inconvenience of confronting him? Julian asked quietly. I do not know what to believe, Adrian admitted, some of her fire fading into something more uncertain. A week ago, I would have said yes without hesitation. Now I am no longer certain of anything, least of all what to expect from you. Julian was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its edge entirely, replaced by something quieter and more resolved. Give me 3 days, he said. I will find proof. Real proof. Not accusations that Voss can dismiss as the bitterness of a family that lost a dispute fairly. And when I have it, I will act, whatever the cost to my own household. Adrian studied his face, searching for any sign of the deflection or delay she had accused him of moments earlier, and found none. 3 days, she agreed finally. The 3 days that followed tested Julian in ways he had not anticipated. He questioned his estate manager, his clerks, and finally Edmund Voss himself, a smooth, unbothered man whose calm denials might have satisfied a less determined investigator. But Julian had learned something from the woman who had challenged him at that first dinner. Something about refusing to accept easy answers simply because they were convenient. He pressed further, cross-referencing land transactions across the entire region, and eventually uncovered a pattern too consistent to be coincidence. 5 separate boundary disputes over 18 months, each one manufactured through subtly altered surveys, each one resolved through the frightened sale of land to companies that, upon closer inspection, traced back through several layers of ownership directly to Edmund Voss. The confrontation, when it came, took place in the same grand hall where Adrian had first delivered her accusation. Julian summoned Voss before the full council, laid out the evidence methodically, piece by piece, and watched the older man's composure crack, for the first time in years of careful deception. You would destroy my career over the word of a merchant's daughter, Voss said, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. I would destroy your career, Julian corrected, over evidence that you have used your position within my household to steal land from families who trusted this estate to deal with them honestly. The word of the merchant's daughter, as you call her, was simply what led me to look closely enough to find it. Voss was stripped of his position that same day, his holdings seized pending a full investigation, and word of his disgrace spread through the region almost as quickly as the earlier rumors about Adrian had done. But the victory carried a cost Julian had not fully anticipated. His mother, Eleanor Ashforde, arrived at the estate within the week, summoned by anxious relatives who feared the scandal would reflect poorly on the family name, and her fury at her son was immediate and unrelenting. You have humiliated this family, Eleanor said, pacing the very hall where the confrontation with Voss had taken place, over a boundary dispute involving a family of farmers, because a girl with no title and no fortune convinced you it mattered more than the stability of your own council. The girl was right, Julian said evenly. Voss was stealing land through deception, and had been for years. Should I have looked away simply because acknowledging it was inconvenient for our family's reputation? You should have handled it quietly, Eleanor snapped. Discreetly. Instead, you have made a public spectacle of it, and worse, you have made yourself the subject of gossip regarding your interest in this Whitlock girl. Do you understand what people are saying, Julian? That the Duke of Ashforde has lost his senses over a woman entirely beneath his station? Then let them say it, Julian replied, though something in his chest tightened at his mother's words, a familiar old fear rising, despite his best efforts to suppress it. I would rather be the subject of gossip for doing what is right than be respected for allowing corruption to continue, simply because exposing it proved inconvenient. Eleanor studied her son for a long moment, her expression shifting from anger into something colder and more calculating. "You care for her," she said finally. It was not a question. Julian did not answer immediately, and his silence was answer enough. "Then you had better decide, and quickly," Eleanor said, "whether you care for her more than you care for everything this family has built over 4 generations. Because I promise you, Julian, you cannot have both. The world we live in does not permit it, whatever foolish notions this girl may have planted in your head." She left the hall without waiting for a response, her footsteps echoing sharply against the marble floor, and Julian stood alone in the sudden quiet, the weight of her words settling over him like a stone he could not quite set down. Word of the confrontation with his mother reached Adrian within days, carried by the same network of gossip that had once painted her as a temptress and now painted her, with equal inaccuracy, as a scheming girl determined to secure a title through whatever means necessary. She heard too of Voss's disgrace, and felt a fierce satisfaction at the news, tempered by an uneasy awareness that the victory had come at a price she had not fully anticipated, a price that Julian was now paying in the currency of his own family's disapproval. She did not know, as she went about her days in the weeks that followed, whether he would decide the price was worth paying, or whether the pressure of his mother's expectations would ultimately prove stronger than whatever fragile thing had grown between them beside the river. All she knew was that the silence stretching between them now felt heavier than any argument they had ever had, and she found herself dreading, more than anything, the possibility that it might never be broken. 2 weeks passed without a single visit from Julian, and Adrian told herself each morning that she did not mind, that she had far more pressing matters to occupy her thoughts than the silence of a man who had made no promises he was obligated to keep. She busied herself with the harvest, with mending the fence along the very fields that had so nearly been lost, with long afternoons spent at the mill listening to Clara's cheerful chatter about matters entirely unrelated to dukes or disputed land. None of it quite worked. She found her attention drifting constantly toward the road that led from the Ashforde estate, watching for a rider who never came. When Julian finally did appear, it was not the arrival she had imagined during those long, restless weeks. He came alone, without his usual escort, dismounting at the edge of the Whitlock property with the tired, unsettled look of a man who had spent too many nights without sleep. Adrian, who had been gathering herbs near the garden wall, straightened at the sight of him, her heart lifting and tightening in the same breath. "You have been gone a long time," she said, before she could decide whether that was an accusation or simply an observation. "I have," Julian admitted. "My mother has made it very clear what she expects of me, and I have spent these past weeks trying to determine whether I have the courage to disappoint her." "And have you decided?" "I do not know," Julian said, with an honesty that struck her harder than any confident declaration could have. "I know what I want, Adrian. I have known it for weeks, if I am honest with myself. But wanting something and being permitted to have it are 2 very different matters when one is born into a position like mine." Adrian set down the basket of herbs she had been carrying, suddenly finding it difficult to hold anything steady. "What is it that you want?" Julian's gaze held hers, unwavering despite the uncertainty in his voice. "You," he said simply. "I want you, Adrian, in a manner that has nothing to do with land disputes or investigations, or convenient excuses to extend my stay at the local inn. I have wanted you since the night you looked me in the eye at your family's table and told me I had forgotten I was still a man beneath the title. No one had ever spoken to me that way before. No one has spoken to me that way since, and I find that I do not wish to live the rest of my life without hearing it." For a moment, Adrian could not find any words at all. She had imagined this conversation. In quieter moments, she was reluctant to admit to herself, but imagining it had done nothing to prepare her for the reality of hearing it spoken aloud, plainly, without the protection of metaphor or careful distance. "Your mother will never accept it," she said finally, because it was the truest thing she could think to say. "Your family, your entire world, will see me as an embarrassment, a scandal to be managed, rather than a woman to be respected. I do not wish to spend my life as something you must apologize for. I would never ask you to be apologized for." "You may not ask it," Adrian said, "but it will happen regardless. The moment we are seen together in public as something more than a duke settling a land dispute with a farmer's daughter. I have already heard what they say about me in the village, Julian, and that is only rumor. I cannot imagine what they would say if it became truth." "Then let them say what they wish," Julian said, echoing the very words he had spoken to his mother weeks earlier, though this time his voice carried none of the defiance and all of the vulnerability beneath it. I have spent my entire life arranging my choices around what other people wish to say about me. I am tired of it, Adrian. I am tired of being a title before I am ever permitted to be a man. That is easy to say now, Adrian said, pulling back slightly, though everything in her wanted to close the distance between them instead. But titles do not disappear simply because a man grows tired of carrying them. You will still be the Duke of Ashforde tomorrow, and the day after, and every day for the rest of your life. And I will still be a merchant's daughter who cannot offer you land, or connections, or anything your family will consider a worthy exchange for the name you would be asking me to share. I am not asking for an exchange, Julian said, frustration creeping into his voice for the first time. I am asking for you, just you, not your family's holdings, not some political advantage, simply the woman who was brave enough to challenge me before she knew whether it would cost her everything. Adrian felt her resolve wavering, felt the careful walls she had built during his weeks of silence beginning to crack under the weight of his sincerity. But beneath the wavering, an old familiar fear held firm. The fear of being made into a spectacle, of becoming the subject of whispered gossip and cold, appraising looks for the rest of her life. Never fully accepted, always slightly suspect in the eyes of a world that had never intended to make room for someone like her. I need time, she said finally, though the words felt inadequate even as she spoke them. This is not a small thing you are asking of me, Julian. I cannot simply decide it in the space of an afternoon. Something in Julian's expression dimmed, though he nodded, accepting her answer with more grace than she had expected. Take whatever time you need, he said. I will not pretend the waiting will be easy, but I would rather wait for your true answer than force a hasty one I might later regret asking for. He left without pressing further, and Adrian watched him ride away with a heart so tangled she could not have said, in that moment, whether she felt relief or regret at having asked for more time. The weeks that followed proved far harder than she had anticipated. Word had somehow reached the village of Julian's visit, of the long private conversation observed from a distance by a neighboring farmhand who had, predictably, embellished every detail before repeating it to anyone willing to listen. Beatrice Fairweather's whispers grew louder, sharper, laced now with open scorn rather than mere curiosity. Adrian found herself avoided by women who had once considered her a friend, and eyed with open speculation by men who suddenly seemed to believe her availability had changed based on rumors of a duke's affection. Worse, in some ways, was the letter that arrived from Eleanor Ashforde herself, delivered by a stern-faced servant who waited in stiff silence while Adrian read it in the privacy of her room. The letter was brief and devastatingly precise, outlining in careful, elegant language exactly what a union between her son and a woman of Adrian's standing would cost the Ashforde name, the political alliances it would unravel, the doors it would close to future generations of the family. It ended with a single line that Adrian read over and over until the words blurred together. If you truly care for my son, you will release him from whatever foolish attachment has formed between you, before it destroys everything he has spent his life building. Adrian did not show the letter to her parents. She folded it carefully and placed it at the bottom of a drawer, though its contents remained lodged in her thoughts like a splinter she could not quite work free. She began, in the days that followed, to convince herself that Eleanor was right, that whatever she felt for Julian, however genuine, was not enough to outweigh the damage it would cause him, the family he would lose, the world that would never fully welcome her, regardless of how fiercely he insisted otherwise. When Julian returned nearly a month later, having given her the time she had asked for, he found a very different woman waiting for him than the one who had asked him to wait. I have thought about what you asked me, Adrian said, before he could speak, her voice carefully controlled in a way that cost her more effort than she let show. And I believe we were mistaken, both of us, to imagine this could ever be simple. Your mother is right, Julian. A union between us would cost you everything you have worked to protect, and I will not be the reason you lose it. Julian's expression shifted from hope to confusion, to something darker and more wounded. My mother spoke to you. It does not matter who spoke to me, Adrian said, though her voice wavered slightly on the words. What matters is that she is correct. I cannot give you what your family needs. I cannot give you alliances, or fortune, or the kind of standing that would make this easier for you. All I can give you is myself, and I have begun to understand that it may simply not be enough. You do not believe that, Julian said, stepping closer, his voice low and urgent. I know you do not believe that, because it is not what you said to me weeks ago, and it is not what I have seen in your eyes every single time I have looked at you since that first dinner. Perhaps I have changed my mind, Adrian said, though even as she spoke the words, she felt how hollow they sounded, and little conviction remained behind them. Julian studied her for a long, silent moment, and Adrian watched something in his expression harden, not with anger, but with a kind of resolve she had not seen from him before. "Very well," he said finally. "If that is truly what you wish, I will not force you to say otherwise. But I do not believe for even a moment that this decision belongs entirely to you. I believe my mother's letter sits somewhere in this house, and I believe it has done more to change your mind in the past weeks than any true change of heart on your part." Adrian said nothing, and her silence told him everything he needed to know. "I will not give up so easily," Julian said quietly, before turning to leave. "Not on this, not on you. But I will give you the space you seem to believe you need, until you are ready to tell me the truth, rather than the version of it my mother has convinced you to believe." He left, and Adrian sank onto the garden bench, her carefully composed expression finally crumbling now that no one remained to witness it. She had told herself she was protecting him, sparing him a future of scandal and diminished standing, but sitting alone in the quiet of the evening, she could no longer be entirely certain whether that had been the truth, or simply the easiest lie to hide behind. Autumn settled over the village in earnest, painting the fields Adrian had once fought so hard to protect in shades of gold and rust. And still she found no peace in any of it. She threw herself into the work of the harvest with a determination that left her exhausted by nightfall, hoping exhaustion might crowd out the thoughts of Julian that persisted no matter how firmly she tried to banish them. It did not work. She thought of him while gathering the last of the wheat, while mending fences, while lying awake long after the rest of the house had gone quiet, replaying every conversation they had shared and wondering, with a growing ache she could not silence, whether she had made a terrible mistake. Clara noticed the change in her friend long before Adrian was willing to admit it aloud. "You have not smiled properly in weeks," Clara said one afternoon, as the two of them sat by the mill in a spot that had become their customary place for honest conversation. "Not since the Duke stopped coming." "I have smiled," Adrian protested weakly. "You have performed smiling," Clara corrected. "There is a difference, and I have known you long enough to see it clearly." She studied her friend's face with the particular scrutiny only a lifelong friend could offer. "What happened, Adrian? You never told me the full truth of it." And so, for the first time, Adrian told someone the entire story, from the letter hidden at the bottom of her drawer, to the wounded look on Julian's face when she had claimed to have changed her mind. Clara listened without interruption, and when Adrian finally fell silent, her friend's expression had turned unexpectedly stern. "You let a letter from a woman who has never once bothered to know you decide your entire future," Clara said. "Adrian Whitlock, I have watched you stand up to a duke at his own dinner table, without so much as a tremor in your voice. Do not tell me a letter from his mother is what finally silenced you." "It is not so simple," Adrian said. "If I had chosen him, I would have cost him everything. His family, his standing, the alliances his estate depends upon. I would have spent the rest of my life being blamed for it, by his mother, by his peers, perhaps even eventually, by him." "Or," Clara said, "you would have spent the rest of your life beside a man who chose you, knowing exactly what it would cost him, and decided you were worth it regardless. You are so busy protecting him from a future that has not even happened yet, that you have forgotten to ask yourself what you actually want, rather than what you fear." Adrian had no answer for that, because her friend, infuriatingly, was entirely correct. She might have continued sitting with that uncomfortable truth for weeks longer, had circumstances not intervened to force her hand. Word reached the village, carried this time not by idle gossip but by an official announcement posted outside the church, that the Duke of Ashforde intended to hold a formal gathering at his estate the following week, an occasion significant enough to draw families from across the entire region. The announcement offered no explanation for the gathering's purpose, only that all who had dealings with the Ashforde estate, including the Whitlock family, were formally invited to attend. Margaret was beside herself with nerves at the prospect, certain that some new calamity awaited them, while Edward attempted, with limited success, to project calm he clearly did not feel. Only Adrian understood, with a certainty she could not fully explain, that the gathering had something to do with her, though she refused to allow herself to hope for what that something might be. The night of the gathering arrived cold and clear, the Ashforde estate lit from top to bottom with a warmth that seemed almost defiant against the season. Adrian stood at the edge of the grand hall in a dress her mother had spent 3 days altering, watching families she recognized from the village mingle uncertainly among Ashforde relatives and estate officials, all of them clearly wondering, as she was, what precisely they had been gathered to witness. Julian appeared at the top of the grand staircase precisely as the last of the guests arrived, and the room fell into a hush that felt entirely different from the anxious silence of that first dinner months earlier. He descended slowly, his expression composed but his eyes searching the crowd until they found Adrian, standing near the back of the hall beside her parents, and held there. "I have gathered you all tonight," Julian said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent hall, "because I owe this region an explanation, and because I have spent too many months allowing fear of judgment to keep me from saying plainly what I believe to be true." He paused, his gaze still fixed on Adrian, though he addressed the entire room. "Some months ago, I came to a dinner at the Whitlock house, prepared to seize land that was never rightfully mine to claim, misled by a member of my own council whose corruption I failed, for too long, to recognize. I was met at that dinner not with the deference I had grown accustomed to, but with honesty, delivered by a woman who refused to let my title excuse my behavior." A murmur rippled through the crowd, and Adrian felt every eye in the room shift toward her, her cheeks burning under the sudden attention. "That honesty," Julian continued, "led me to uncover the corruption within my own estate, and I am grateful for it, whatever discomfort it has cost me since. But it also led to something I did not expect, and have since spent months trying, unsuccessfully, to set aside out of concern for what my family and my peers might say." He descended the final steps and crossed the hall, the crowd parting silently before him, until he stood directly before Adrian, close enough that she could see the uncertainty beneath his composure, the same vulnerability she had glimpsed by the river all those months ago. "I have decided, tonight, that I am done setting it aside." "Julian," Adrian whispered, aware of the entire hall watching, though in that moment she found she could not bring herself to care. "I do not offer you a title, or land, or any of the things my family believes should matter most in a match such as this," Julian said, his voice steady despite the enormity of what he was saying in front of so many witnesses. "I offer you only myself, whatever that is worth, and the promise that I would rather spend my life defending our match against every objection my family and my peers can raise, than spend it without you, simply because defending it proved difficult." Across the hall, Eleanor Ashforde stood rigid with disapproval, her expression a mask of controlled fury, though even she seemed to understand, watching her son, that no argument she might raise tonight would be enough to change his course. Beside her, several of the Ashforde relatives exchanged uneasy glances, clearly uncertain whether to be scandalized or, in a few cases Adrian noticed with surprise, quietly impressed. Adrian looked at Julian, at the man who had walked into her family's home months earlier as an arrogant stranger, and stood before her now stripped of every pretense his title had once afforded him, offering nothing but the truth of what he felt. She thought of Clara's words, of the fear that had kept her silent for weeks, of the letter still hidden at the bottom of her drawer that she had allowed to speak louder than her own heart. "I let your mother's letter convince me that protecting you meant staying away from you," Adrian said, her voice trembling slightly despite her efforts to steady it. "I told myself I was sparing you a difficult future, but I think, if I am honest, I was simply afraid of a future I did not believe I deserved to have." "You deserve whatever future you choose," Julian said quietly. "I would like very much for that future to include me, if you will still have it." The hall had gone utterly silent, every guest holding their breath for her answer, and Adrian realized, with sudden clarity, that she no longer cared what any of them thought. She had spent her entire life speaking honestly regardless of the cost, and she was not about to abandon that honesty now, in the one moment it mattered most. "Yes," she said simply, "I will have it. I will have you, Julian, title and all the difficulty that comes with it, because I have discovered that a future without you is far harder to bear than any scandal your family fears I might bring." The hall erupted, not entirely in approval, for several of the Ashforde relatives remained visibly displeased, but in a wave of astonished murmuring that Julian silenced, simply by reaching for Adrian's hand and holding it firmly in front of every witness present, a gesture that left no room for doubt or misinterpretation. Eleanor Ashforde did not offer her blessing that night, nor for some weeks afterward, but watching her son's transformation in the months that followed, from a man who had measured his every decision against expectation, to one who measured it instead against what he believed to be right, even she found her resistance softening, slowly, into something that eventually, grudgingly, resembled acceptance. The village too took time to adjust to the idea of a duke's wife who had once worked the fields with her own hands, who spoke her mind without hesitation regardless of who stood before her, and who showed no sign of changing either habit, simply because a title had been added to her name. Beatrice Fairweather found new subjects for her gossip soon enough, though none of it ever again carried the sharp edge of scorn it once had toward Adrian, who had, in the end, proven far more formidable than anyone in the village had first believed her capable of being. On the day of their wedding, held not at the grand Ashforde estate but at the small village church where Adrian had been christened, Julian stood at the front of a hall filled with an unusual mixture of nobility and farmers, estate officials and millers, all gathered to witness a union that had once seemed impossible to nearly everyone involved. Clara stood beside Adrian as she walked down the aisle, beaming with the particular satisfaction of a friend who had been right all along, while Margaret wept openly, and Edward struggled, with limited success, to maintain his composure. When Adrian reached the front of the church, Julian took her hands in his, and for a moment neither of them spoke, simply looking at one another with the quiet astonishment of two people who had somehow found their way to each other despite every obstacle placed between them. "I told you once that I did not know what to do with what I was feeling," Julian said softly, meant only for her, because I was not raised to feel it at all. "I know now. I have known since the first night you refused to let me forget I was still a man beneath the title." "And I told you," Adrian replied, "that curiosity from a man with your power was the most dangerous thing of all." She smiled. The walls she had once guarded so carefully now entirely gone. "I believe I was right, though not in the way I feared. It was dangerous only to the version of myself who believed she did not deserve this." Outside the church, the village had gathered in numbers no one had anticipated, farmers and merchants and estate workers alike, drawn by an occasion that had become, in its own quiet way, a story the entire region would tell for years to come. It was not the story anyone had expected when Julian Ashforde first knocked on the Whitlock door with cold disapproval written across his face. It was, instead, the story of a woman who had refused to bow simply because a title demanded it, and a man who had discovered, through her defiance, the version of himself he had spent his whole life searching for without ever knowing it. They rode away from the church together, as the sun began to set over the very fields where it had all begun, no longer divided by boundary disputes or family expectation, but joined, at last, in a future neither of them had believed possible on that first cold evening, when an arrogant duke had come to dinner and found, waiting at the table, the only woman brave enough to defy him.